So now we're at part 4 of the book The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal, who is a Holocaust survivor and is recounting a story when he was a prisoner of war in his hometown and is on a march to a work detail. And we continue with the story. We halted in front of the technical high school. It looked unaltered. The main building, a neoclassic structure in terracotta and yellow, stood some distance back from the street, from which it was separated by a stone wall with a high iron fence. At examination time, I had often walked along this fence and gazed through the railings at the radical students waiting for their victims. Over the broad entrance gates would be a banner inscribed, "The Day Without Jews." From the gate to the door of the building, armed students forming a cordon would scrutinize everybody who wanted to enter the building. So here I was once again, standing outside this gateway. This time there were no banners, no students to make Jews run the gauntlet, only a few German guards, and above the entrance a board inscribed "Reserve Hospital." An SS man from the camp had a few words with a sentry, and then the gate was opened. We marched past the well-kept lawns and turned left from the main entrance and were led round the building into the courtyard. It lay in deep shadow. Ambulances drove in and out, and once or twice we had to stand aside to let them pass. Then we were handed over to a sergeant of the medical corps who assigned us our duties. I had a curious feeling of strangeness in these surroundings, although I'd spent several years here. I tried to remember whether I had been in this back courtyard before. What would have brought me here? We were usually content to be able to get into the building and out again without being molested or without explaining the topography. Large concrete containers were arranged around the courtyard and they seemed to be filled with blood-stained bandages. The ground was covered with empty boxes, sacks and packing material, which a group of prisoners was busy loading into trucks. The air stank with a mixture of strong-smelling medications, disinfectants, and putrefaction. Red Cross sisters and medical orderlies were hurrying to and fro. The Askaris had left the shady, smelly courtyard and were sunning themselves on the grass a short distance away. Some were rolling cigarettes of newspapers stuffed with tobacco, just as they wanted to do when they were in Russia. Some lightly wounded and convalescent soldiers sat on the benches watching the Askaris, whom they recognized at once as being Russians, in spite of the German uniforms they wore. We could hear them inquiring about us too. One soldier got up from the bench and came over towards us. He looked at us in an impersonal way, as if we were animals in a zoo. Probably he was wondering how long we had to live. Then he pointed to his arm, which was in a sling, and called out, "You Jewish swine, that's your brothers, your damned brothers. Communists, you have done this for me. But you'll soon kick the bucket, all of you." The other soldiers didn't seem to share his views. They looked at us sympathetically, and one of them shook his head doubtfully, but none dared to say a word. The soldier who had approached us uttered a few more curses and then sat down again in the sunshine. I thought to myself that this vile creature would one day have a sunflower planted on his grave to watch over him. I looked at him closely, and all at once I saw a sunflower. My stare seemed to upset him, for he picked up a stone and threw it at me. The stone missed, and the sunflower vanished. At that moment I felt desperately alone, and wished Arthur had been included in my group. The orderly in charge of us finally led us away. Our job was to carry cartons filled with rubbish out of the building. Their contents apparently came from the operating theatres, and the stench made one's throat contract. As I stepped aside to get a few breaths of clean air, I noticed a small, plump nurse who wore the grey-blue uniform with white fringes and a regulation white cap. She looked at me curiously and then came straight over to me. "Are you a Jew?" she asked. I looked at her wonderingly. Why did she ask? Could she not see it for herself from my clothes and my features? Was she trying to be insulting? What was the object of her question? A sympathetic soul, perhaps. I thought maybe she wanted to slip me some bread and was afraid to do it with the others looking on. 2 months previously, when I was working on the Eastern Railway loading oxygen cylinders, a soldier had climbed out of a truck on a siding close by and come over to me. He said he had been watching us for some time and we looked as if we didn't get enough to eat. "In my knapsack over there you'll find a piece of bread. Go and fetch it," he said. I asked, "Why don't you give it to me yourself? It's forbidden for me to give anything to a Jew." "I know," I said. "All the same, if you want me to have it, you give it to me." He smiled. "No, you take it. Then I can swear with a clear conscience that I didn't give it to you." I thought of this incident as I followed the Red Cross nurse into the building in accordance with her instructions. The thick walls made the inside of the building refreshingly cool. The nurse walked rather fast. Where was she taking me? If her purpose was to give me something, then she could have done it here and now in front of the staircase, since nobody was in sight. But the nurse just turned around once to confirm that I was still following her. We climbed the staircase, and strange to relate, I could not remember ever having seen it before. At the next story I saw nurses who were coming towards us, and a doctor looked at me sharply as if to say, "What is that fellow doing here?" We reached the upper hall where not so long ago my diploma had been handed to me. The nurse stopped and exchanged a few words with another nurse. I asked myself whether I had better bolt. I was on well-known ground. I knew where each corridor led to, and I could easily escape. Let her look for somebody else, whatever it was she needed. Suddenly, I forgot I was there. I forgot the nurse, and even the camp. There on the right was the way to Professor Bergiak's office, and there on the left the way to Professor Derdiak's office. Both were notorious for their dislike of Jewish students. I had done my diploma work with Derdiak, a design for a sanitarium, and Bergerac had corrected me many times. When he had to deal with a Jewish student, he seemed to lose his breath and stuttered more than usual. I could still see his hand making lines across my drawings with a thick pencil, and a hand with a large signet ring. Then the nurse signalled me to wait, and I came back to earth. I leaned over the balustrade and looked down at the busy throng in the lower hall. Wounded were being brought in on stretchers. There was a constant coming and going. Soldiers limped past on crutches, and one soldier on a stretcher looked up at me, his features distorted with pain. Then another fragment from the past recurred to my memory. It was during the student riots of 1936. The anti-Semitic bands had hurled a Jewish student over the balustrade into the lower hall, and he lay there just like this soldier, possibly on the very same spot. Just past the balustrade was a door which had led to the office of the Dean of Architecture, and it was here we handed in our exercise book to the professors to be marked. The Dean in my time was a quiet man. very polite, very correct. He had never known whether he was for or against Jews. He always responded to our greetings with distant politeness. One could almost physically feel his aloofness. Or was it merely an excess of sensitiveness that made us divide people into two groups? Those that liked Jews and those that disliked them. Constant Jew baiting gave rise to such thoughts. Then the nurse came back and dragged me once again out of the past. I could see from the look in her eyes that she was pleased to find me still there. She walked quickly along the balustrade, around the hall, and stopped in front of the door of the dean's room. "Wait here till I call you," she said. I nodded, looked up the staircase. Orderlies were bringing down a motionless figure on a stretcher. There had never been a lift in the building, and the Germans had not installed one either. After a few moments, the nurse came out of the dean's room, caught me by the arm, and pushed me through the door. I looked for familiar objects, the writing desk, the cupboards in which our papers were kept, but those relics of the past had vanished. There was now only a white bed, with a night table beside it. Something white was looking at me out of the blankets. At first, I couldn't grasp the situation. Then the nurse bent over the bed and whispered, and I heard somewhat a deeper whisper, apparently in answer. Although the place was in semi-darkness, I could now see a figure wrapped in white, motionless on the bed. I tried to trace the outlines of the body under the sheets, and I looked for its head. The nurse straightened up and said quietly, "Stay here." Then she went out of the room. From the bed I heard a weak, broken voice exclaim, "Please come nearer. I can't speak loudly." Now I could see the figure in the bed more clearly. White, bloodless hands on the counterpane. Head completely banished, with openings for the mouth and the nose and the ears. The feeling of unreality persisted. It was an uncanny situation. The corpse-like hands, the bandages, and the place in which this strange encounter was taking place. I didn't know who this wounded man was, but obviously he was a German. Hesitatingly, I sat down on the edge of the bed. The sick man, perceiving this, said softly, "Please come a little nearer. To talk loudly is too exhausting for me." I obeyed. His almost bloodless hand groped for mine as he tried to raise himself slightly in the bed. My bewilderment was intense. I didn't know whether this unreal scene was actually a dream. Here was I, in the ragged clothes of a concentration camp prisoner, in the room of the former dean of Lemberg High School, now a military hospital, in a sick room, which must be in reality a death chamber. As my eyes became accustomed to the semi-darkness, I could see that the white bandages were mottled with yellow stains, perhaps ointment, or was it pus? The bandaged head was spectral. I sat on the bed, spellbound. I could not take my eyes off the stricken man and the grey-yellow stains on the bandages. They seemed to be moving, taking new shapes for my eyes. "I have not much longer to live," whispered the sick man in a barely audible voice. "I know the end is near." Then he fell silent. Was he thinking what to say next, or had he a premonition of death which scared him? I looked more closely. He was very thin, and under his shirt his bones were clearly visible, almost bursting through his parched skin. I was unmoved by his words. The way I had been forced to exist in the prison camps had destroyed in me any feeling of or fear of death. Sickness, suffering, and doom were the constant companions of us Jews. Such things no longer frightened us. Nearly a fortnight before this confrontation with the dying man, I had occasion to visit a store in which cement sacks were being kept. I heard groans, and going to investigate, I saw one of the prisoners lying amongst the sacks. I asked him what was the matter, and he said, "I'm dying." He muttered in a choked voice, "I shall die. There is nobody in the world to help me and nobody to mourn my death." Then he added casually, "I'm 22. I ran out of the shed and found the prison doctor. He shrugged his shoulders and turned away. He said, "There are a couple of 100 men working here today. 6 of them are dying." He did not even ask where the dying man was. I said, "You ought to go and at least look at him." I protested. "I couldn't do anything for him," he answered. "But you as a doctor have more liberty to move about. You could explain your absence to the guards better than I could. It is frightful for a man to die lonely and abandoned. Help him, at least in his dying hour." Good, he said. But I knew that he would not go. He too had lost all feeling for death. At the evening roll call there were 6 corpses. They were included without comment. The doctor's estimate was correct. Well, part 5 next time. Shabbat Shalom, Mike Fryer.